Okay, the Thursday, November 1st, 2018 Water Quality Management Committee will come to order. Before we get into the agenda items, we have a couple of introductions here. Brian Handy, whose name has been associated with the cranberry bogs in this town for as long as anyone can remember, and more recently in our conversations about Mill Pond, was in Town Hall and came by, and thank you for coming by. He's been following with interest our discussions about Mill Pond, and if there's anything you'd like to say, we'd be happy to have you do it. The TV people want to have you use the microphone if you wouldn't mind. So our nationwide TV audience can hear you.
Well, that's good. It's been a while since I've been up here and I haven't really missed it, but I was mentioning the Enterprise, so that kind of perked up my attention, especially one of the possible recommendations of taking the dam out of 28, and the discussions I've had today that's not going to happen, so that's good, because it would definitely negative impact on 20 acres of productive cranberry bog. So outside of that, I've gone through the report somewhat. There's a lot of detail, and I haven't gone through it totally, but one thing I think needs to be mentioned, and I imagine you people know it, that there's a lot of houses around Mill Pond. Certainly have a lot of effect. And looking through the report, I don't really see that's mentioned too often. It seems to kind of focus on the cranberry bog operation. And I'd be willing to bet that the houses have a far greater impact. I'm not saying that the cranberry bog operations doesn't have any impact, and certainly, as it reads in the report, that I'm willing to work on some possible things that I can do differently to see if that affects the situation. So certainly willing to work. I'm not going to be confrontational on it, but just especially now that the dam is safe, because then that would be a battle that I'd enter into. But other than that, I'm happy to do whatever we can do as long as it doesn't negative impact on my operation. But there's things we can do. So hope that I get some communications between this group and myself, and so we keep in the loop.
That's great.
I really am delighted to see you, and I think that the report indicated that the conversations between the researchers and yourself had brought up sort of two suggestions where operations on the bog could reduce the detritus and that goes downstream and then ends up in the pond. So I was just wondering, in terms of your workload, when's the best time of year for us to get into some really specific conversations about how that could be addressed?
It'd be now until March.
Now until March, okay.
Or first part of April.
Okay, great. And if you can give us, what's the best number to reach you at?
508
Okay.
958 4586.
Good, all right. As I remember, for cranberry operations, we don't have to go through the Conservation Commission. No. Right, okay, that makes it easier.
That's a plus.
Yeah.
I'm sure you would agree. Well, thank you. The piece she was referring to was this filter.
It's a grate, actually.
That they talked about.
Well, there's two parts. There's a grate, and there's also a small piece of wetland that I got into a battle years ago trying to make into bog. It's within the bog, and there was a talk about making that into some sort of sedimentation pond.
Right, exactly.
So that's the other.
That's the other piece
that he mentioned, and also some adjusting of the boards during the winter time, so it allow some water to flow constantly.
Right.
As long as the bogs are flooded, that could be done.
Did all those things make sense to you?
I mean, they're doable. I don't know how, I'm not a scientist. I don't know how it affects the But I would think the sedimentation pond would certainly be a plus. I don't think there's a lot of vegetative matter going down the stream, but you could catch whatever there is.
Exactly.
Fine. Well, thank you for coming. We
All right,
really,
thank you.
we
Yes.
appreciate it, and we have your number.
Brian, do you have any questions for us?
No, just, like I said, I'm interested in being in the loop.
Yep, good.
I don't like reading stuff.
I like it too.
I'd rather be part of the solution than, just be identified in the paper as
Sure.
culprit.
Okay. Now, Eric, I think you have an introduction for us.
Yeah. So I'm going to introduce Kristen Rathjen, who's sitting over there. She's recently joined ScienceWares and will be assisting with technical issues relating to the Water Quality Management Committee. She has a background in marine, estuarine, and environmental science from University of Maryland College Park in 2010, and has been working recently with Smithers Viciant, and has a scientific background as well as the ability to deal with some of the regulatory issues. And so welcome aboard, and thank you for taking a leap of faith that there's exciting stuff going
She
on.
came to our last meeting, and she's still here, so.
No.
She couldn't find the door.
So that's good. I have a resume, which I'll pass around to the members of the committee, just so you get a sense of what a superbly qualified person we have fallen into here.
Great. Welcome.
Thank you.
We'll start including her email. It's krathjen@sciencewares.com, and a phone number and all that. So you'll start getting emails from her shortly.
Okay.
Shall we?
Okay. Yeah, I guess, okay, now we'll get on to the first agenda item, which is a discussion of the report that SMAS did entitled Pond Watch Nutrient-Related Water Quality, Owens Pond, Great Pond, Green Pond, Little Pond, Oyster Pond, West Falmouth Harbor, Sampling Assessment 2004 to 2017. This is something the committee asked for some time ago to kind of consolidate all the annual information that's been gathered on all these estuaries and define what the trends are, and that's pretty much what it's about.
So I'm just going to go through, I think everybody has gotten the report by email, but just for our benefit, before we begin the discussion, I'm just going to summarize the main findings from the report. So there's going to be 2 slides from each estuary. There were 6 estuaries considered. And on the slides, on the left-hand side is a salinity chart, and on the right-hand side is a total nitrogen chart running from 2004 all the way up until 2017. And one of the things that was found in Bournes Pond was that there was a total nitrogen increase that seemed consistent with the past 15 to 20 years. Oh, also there's a, I can use the mouse, there's a map over here showing where the sampling stations were. So B1, typically 1 is at the top and 6 are, the bigger numbers are closer to the ocean. And you can barely read in the legends down here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and whatnot. At any rate, there's a trend line right here that shows a gradual increase, and this is the slope and the fit coefficient and whatnot. I'm just repeating what Brian put in the report in summary form, and then we can have a discussion about whether we agree with what we see. So one of the things that he called out about the estuary is that in 2016 and 2017, we had the salinity 1 year go up and the total nitrogen went down. And then the next year, the salinity went down and the total nitrogen went up. So you can kind of see the salinity taking a dive here, except for that one station. And then the total nitrogen jumping up, except for a couple of these stations. But the significant thing is that a rise in salinity generally indicates flushing. And this is a theme that we'll see throughout the report, might lead us to believe that global warming and sea level rise is a good thing for nitrogen because it will bring more water into the estuary and dilute the nitrogen. However, I don't think that we should jump in that boat just yet. At any rate, there does seem to be a correlation between flushing and lower levels of nitrogen in the pond. And so in Bournes Pond, especially down at these 5 and 6 stations that are close to the entrance, we did see some lower nitrogen in recent years. So you can see this chart here is organized not in number order, but rather in distance from the inlet order. That's why we have 5 and then 4 and then 6. And it's possible to see that the nitrogen, again, we have the average and the standard deviation. This is data that was in a table form in the report, and I just put it in a chart form. The green line is the MEP level, which doesn't have an error bar. And then there's the 2004 to 2014 all averaged together, and then the 2015 to 2017 all averaged together. So there's a lot of data that goes into that, and it's averaged across all the stations, and we can debate whether that's a meaningful analysis, but this is just a chart representation of the same data that was in that table for each watershed. And then we have a green line here showing what the total nitrogen threshold was that was established for each estuary. And we can see that Bournes Pond is basically everywhere except B6 above that line. Another thing I'd like to point out is on this scale over here, we have total nitrogen in milligrams per liter, and I've made an effort to keep this scale the same on every chart for every estuary, so we'll get a sense of which estuaries have the highest nitrogen loads in an absolute sense. So we can see here, even up at the number 1 station here near the road, we're up around 1 milligram per liter. Just something to keep in mind. This chlorophyll A chart shows up for every estuary as well, and anything above 10, you can see the 10 here. Each chart has a different scale. I just took the charts out of the report, but anything above 10 is kind of in this yellow area, is considered indicative of a impaired situation where you have too much nutrients, and so you have an excess of phytoplankton and other forms of biological material that are taking up those nutrients. And so typically an algae bloom is what you'd see. And in Bournes Pond, you can see that a lot of these stations are in that compromised area. So we'll go a little bit more quickly through some of these other estuaries. Great Pond, there was a jump up in total nitrogen since the MEP. So this would be 2004. There appears to have been a little step up, but according to what their analysis suggested, that now the nitrogen levels are relatively stable. And the interannual changes, so that you see a jump up and then a drop down, versus the trends, shows the value of long-term monitoring. They felt like there were some useful things that could be learned from being able to evaluate year over year against a long-standing trend line. So I'm just going to turn us over here. Now we're over the 1 milligram per liter line at most of these stations. GT1 is again all the way up in the north here, and you can see a sharp increase at GT1 and then a little bit less of an increase down by GT6. Again, all of these stations in 2017 were in the no-go zone for chlorophyll in Great Pond. Over to Green Pond, the total nitrogen seemed to be stable, was their assessment. The upper half continues to be highly impaired, and a chlorophyll A drop in 2011 through 2014 may be from a sampling frequency issue. Algae blooms come and go on a somewhat short time scale, and they felt like maybe the timing of the sampling was what was responsible for an apparent drop in chlorophyll that was observed in 2014. Hard to say definitively whether that's meaningful, but there it is. And we can see once again the upstream estuaries, or the upstream stations, tend to have these much higher nitrogen levels. And then when you get close to the inlet, we're almost at the threshold where we think we need to be in order to have the estuary recover. Little Pond has total nitrogen increasing in spite of the addition of a sewer, and the thinking on that is that there's lots of stored nitrogen in the water table. In 2017, the nitrogen actually dropped, and the suspicion is that that is from tidal flushing being higher. There's a little jump in salinity here in the, I'm not sure that it corresponds to the correct stations, but at any rate, that's some of the thinking that was suggested in the report. But you can see an overall trend line here with not the best fit, but at any rate does show increasing total nitrogen. And here we have in Little Pond well over 2 milligrams per liter up at the top, at the head, and even further down, still close to 1. Very high levels of nitrogen in Little Pond. So thinking about where you're going to put your effort, Little Pond's probably a very good choice to put in a sewer, just from an overall nitrogen concentration perspective. Oyster Pond was studied a little bit differently from some of the other estuaries because it's got some deep areas, and so there was some profiling done to look at the water quality at 0 feet, and then 2 feet, or sorry, 0 meters, 2 meters, 4 meters, and there was some interesting information that came out of that, which we'll see on the next slide. There does seem to be an increase in total nitrogen, and the thinking behind that is that there's nitrogen stored in the deep anoxic waters of Oyster Pond that has been brought up due to increased mixing activity, and that this is not the result of watershed inputs in Oyster Pond. That's what the report suggested. There was a typical response here. You see the flushing. When the salinity goes up right here, the total nitrogen comes down from 2016 to 2017. There was also a comment that a salinity drop to 1 part per thousand in the pond is problematic. Again, this is a much lower salinity pond than any of the other ponds, but this dip and this dip over here are indicators that the pond is not being managed properly at the weir, and so this goes into a recommendation that he gives at the end of the report that somebody take a closer look at what's going on with the inlets to these estuaries. So here is perhaps a little bit of a confusing chart. We have OP1 at 0 meters, 2 meters, and 4 meters, and then we have OP2 at 0, 2, and 3¼ meters, and then OP3 at 0, 2, 4, and 6 meters. And that dash number is the depth in meters. And it's, you know, these are off the chart
Yeah.
at the bottom because it's anoxic and there's a ton of anaerobic activity down there and just nitrogen sitting in the water. So the theory is that some of this heavily nitrogen-laden water is coming up to the surface because the pond is mixing a little bit more for reasons that, you know, a lot of possible mechanisms. I don't think there was one that jumped out as this is causing it. But at any rate, that's the thinking. Down here is the salinity profile. And so you can see in 2008 and 2016, there was no salinity stratification all the way down to 6 meters. And those were the 2 years when the pond was down to 1 part per thousand in salinity. And the thinking is that the inlet was not open enough. And once it got open enough, there was more stratification and kept the anoxic nitrogen-laden water down at the bottom. So again, most of the stations are over the threshold, but aside from down in the bottom, we're actually doing pretty well in Oyster Pond relative to the other estuaries. Okay, West Falmouth Harbor. The total nitrogen is stable or increasing as the high concentration plume from the wastewater treatment facility washes out. So this is something we'll see in the final conclusions as well. That plume hasn't disappeared yet, hasn't washed out. Here the salinity chart is on top and the total nitrogen chart is on the bottom. There does seem to be a slight increase overall. And if we look over here, this West Falmouth 1, which is all the way up in here, probably closest to the plume, is significantly higher than the other ones, except for West Falmouth 8, which is right here. So those 2 stations are higher, but again, everything is substantially lower than some of the other estuaries. And another observation about West Falmouth is that the salinity stays very constant, so total tidal flushing is not really changing the nitrogen concentrations. It's actually driven more by what's coming in from the groundwater, most likely, and other sources, instead of being affected by flushing. So improving flushing in West Falmouth Harbor is not likely to improve the situation. So conclusions, common features of all 6 estuaries. They support nitrogen-rich waters, especially in the upper reaches. That's why the bar on the left was always higher than the other bars. There's been no water quality improvement since the MEP assessment, and without intervention, impairment is expected to increase in all of these estuaries. The rate of eutrophication will continue to accelerate. The high nitrogen plume from the wastewater treatment facility does not appear to have flushed out of the aquifer. yet, so it's continuing to affect West Falmouth Harbor. Once that plume does wash out, however, because of the high level of tidal flushing, things should get better, is what's expected. Little Pond seems to have some tidal inflow restrictions, and one of the things I may not have mentioned is that there does seem to be a quick response between a change in tidal flushing and the salinity and the corresponding total nitrogen. So making an adjustment to Little Pond is expected to have a directly observable effect. Or I should say making an inflow adjustment is expected to have a somewhat directly measurable effect.
Dredging,
Yes.
dredging, that's the word you need to say.
Okay, dredging is expected to have a measurable effect in a short time frame. And the sewer project, on the other hand, is likely to take 10 years to have a measurable effect on the water quality parameters, is at least what was suggested in the report. Bournes and Little Pond, the total nitrogen increases are in line with the MEP projections. And this, I think, was one of the big sort of new things to consider for Pond Watch, is undertaking an evaluation of the inlet maintenance, especially in Great Pond, Little Pond, and Bournes Pond, and possibly Green Pond. The thinking being that dredging or other systems of managing the flushing could improve water quality in those estuaries. And possibly by monitoring that more closely to know exactly what's coming in would help the predictive activities and the planning activities. So there may have been other things in the report, so if anyone's read something and wants to bring it out, this might be a great time for that.
Sure. Comments, observations, questions?
I guess I could go. I'm just curious if, I wasn't able to read the report in detail, so the significance of the increases in total nitrogen with respect to the removal requirement that we'll need for those estuaries relative to the TMDL. Was that commented upon?
There wasn't a direct comment on
No.
that.
No, this is
Does it
really,
imply that an adjustment needs to be made to those numbers, those total nitrogen increases, for example, in Great Pond?
okay.
Yeah.
He certainly did not address that. Our sort of general term for this report is the trends analysis. And it was actually requested by DEP and MEPA to be part of the update to the CWMP that we're going to file next year. So they were interested to see whether sharp increases, no increases. I would call, when you look at those black lines, the increase is gradual. So I don't know that that would really trigger a re-examination of the Sentinel station at this point. Not to say that they might not do that down the road. I do think for Little Pond, because the sewering has not had a chance to take effect, that this is really good baseline information against which to look at for the next 5 years. I think based on what the USGS has said, I don't think we'll have to wait 10 years. I think it's more like in the 5-year timeframe.
Yeah, or less, I think.
Well, sure.
Those-
I don't want to be
Most of
too
the systems are
rosy.
so close to the water's edge
Yes.
that if we don't see something pretty quickly, I think we're gonna look.
We're going to wonder about the chemistry.
Well, yeah.
There's a lot, it's interesting, there's a lot of discussion about the nitrogen stored in the groundwater, and that
Yes.
needs time to flush out. But there's a lot of nitrogen stored within the ponds themselves, and we
Right.
don't hear a lot about that. And that's the wild card
That
in
is,
my mind.
And Oyster Pond is a great case study of that,
yeah.
is that
Yeah.
we can see the nitrogen down there.
As far as the West Falmouth plume goes, Amy Lowell gave a presentation a year or so ago with a number of nice graphs, and it seemed obvious to me that you could take some of those, and I won't go into the details now, but you could manipulate that data to give you a very good prediction of when to expect that train to arrive at the station.
Yes.
I mean, you could see the end of it at one or two earlier spots, and all you have to do is superimpose that on a map, and you can figure out if the train keeps going at the same rate when it gets to the next station. But no one seemed interested in pursuing that. It was almost as though somebody didn't want to know when it was going to arrive there, but I think if you did want to know, you could figure it out.
That would be an exciting exercise.
Yes, that may just simply have been a staffing issue. I don't think it's, nobody doesn't want to know that.
Okay, well,
And we can definitely take a look at that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
everyone's a little leery of making predictions since they can be wrong.
well, I mean, but you put a caveat on it that this is your best prediction, that it's a guess, it's an estimate, and then when it comes out right, you look pretty good.
And it would,
Yeah,
yeah.
Ron?
Oh, thanks, Eric. In reading the report, I think your presentation is much clearer.
Yeah.
And what I was able to glean from the report, actually, you really, I mean, especially that bar graph at the bottom,
Very
that was very helpful.
Me too.
But on top of that, I mean, you could still find your way through all the numbers in the report, which is what that's based on. So I think that's one point, but some things were touched on in the report that were not fully discussed, I'd say. One of them is variations in precipitation from year to year, and that's been pretty radical. We've had some drought years followed by major precipitation, drought years, but probably precipitation, it would be to see that developed a little more in the report would be great. And then we had discussed this previously, and maybe that to some extent, even with West Falmouth Harbor, which 3 years ago should have been pristine, okay, based on the early projections. So that's why people are being cautious now. But even there is, and this was in the original MEP reports, and they did all the calculations, which is the significance of build-out in the watershed, which wasn't really touched on in this report, because that could be quantified. And if that could override, to some extent, the improved discharge from the wastewater treatment plant, it could just be that a lot more septic systems are now in that basin and could work it out. I mean, it was predicted in the MEP report about that, but here we're not seeing that, and that would be a good thing to see quantified in the report so that we can get a sense of of what impacts that has, and because build out is significant. And then the other element that's mentioned in here for some reason, which is good to see, I think, is that for Bourne's Pond, there was mention of the oyster aspect, the shellfish activities that are going on there for water quality improvement as well as production. But there's it almost starts at the beginning, you think, okay, there's something coming, but it just sort of doesn't come. And this year they should have had data collected well before the date of this report, which was October, just 10 days ago or something. But maybe it would be good to have that discussed, and maybe even based on the data they've collected, and have an appendix put on to say, well, this is showing something. So that would be part of the trend, is that we're now seeing a certain impact, because they did, I assume this summer, this 2018, they actually went out and did the full study of the float, at least for floating bags. So I would think that would be a dimension that would at least give some indication of something, even though it's very localized. It was a relatively small scale, but at the same time, in that area where the intervention took place, it could be that there's something significant.
Right, it was right around where the B3, I mean, it's in between.
Right, okay.
Yeah, it was basically right in this area,
Right.
and this area here.
Yeah, so, but anyway, they should have a lot more data from that
Yeah.
area that would be part of this whole element. I mean, maybe there's something indicative, either something good happened, or something didn't happen, or something, it may be, or maybe we don't know yet. But the point is that there's more information out there that could help with that.
There will be a report on this data collected and the oyster activities in Bourne's Pond this summer. It's going to be a separate report. The way the contracts were written. There's a contract for them to do the trend analysis between the date in early 2000 and 2017. That's the contract. And so rather than an appendix to this report, we're going to have a standalone report on the work of Bourne's Pond. They will obviously use this information when they make that report. But I just, just from a contractual point of view and also a time point of view,
Right.
we need to get this report. We've been waiting for months for it. And so we need to get this report out and finalized. And so I don't want to add a new task in the form of an appendix for a particular pond.
So Virginia, when you say this report, you mean the one right in
The
front of us?
trend analysis,
now.
the trend analysis you're looking at.
Okay,
and
so
the-
can I talk strategy for a minute and get away
Yes.
from details? Because if we're gonna make decisions based on this material, we have a responsibility to see that it's high quality. And as I read through the thing, even in certain paragraphs, it's internally inconsistent. And these trend lines with these vanishingly small correlation coefficients, I think it behooves us not to include stuff like that. There's increases that are seen that the vast majority of people that would look at say, there's no increase there, it's flat. And they have a mountain of data, and they've mushed it all through and run their statistics program on it, and boom, there's your trend line. But it may be meaningless, and I wish this thing was edited before it got to us, because I don't think our responsibility is to edit it.
Okay.
And there's a couple of caption legends, figure legends that I don't know what they're supposed to mean, but they don't
Don't make sense.
make any sense.
I
And
agree with Tom.
Yeah.
I was very frustrated reading this
Mhm.
because there's a lot of wheel spinning going on.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Just one other point on that, you know, I agree, as I said earlier, that it's, you're sort of going in several directions at once, and your
Yeah.
eyes are crossing even at times. But the one element that would be really good for this report would be, which I think is good for all of these types of reports, to have a good executive summary up front. It basically goes bang, 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 and then at least that'll be clear, you know, kind of.
Yeah.
And that's more on the lines of what Eric just presented.
it's,
Yeah, well, sort of, right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Just a thought, you know, I do think that these numbers and the error bars and whatnot, they are what they are. And I agree that maybe we could have less interpretation and more just presentation in the draft or in the final report. And then it seemed like the issue of tidal flushing, I didn't see any statistics to back that up. So maybe we could ask for, because if it's going to be the basis of we think we should dredge, it'd be great to show that there's a reason why we think we should dredge based on the numbers that we've seen for the water quality. You know.
But, yeah, on that too, that it isn't just the inlet for flushing, it's also precipitation and the dilution effect.
And that would be a good thing to
Which is
look
the
at.
same thing, to see how
Is
those
there a
things,
correlation?
you know, compound each other or whatever, it would be good.
Quite a few years ago, Steve Rafferty did that for some data from Little Pond. There was some very confusing data. And he had the amazing insight to drop out, I don't know, years or weeks or months when there was heavy rainfall. And when you did that, the data became
Much clearer.
much clearer.
I remember that, yes.
yep.
I don't remember the details, but he probably would.
Yeah. So that would be possible to do, I think, in this case, to get a record of precipitation and pull those data points out and adjust some of these trends based on that.
It could be like with Bourne's Pond there, that the, you know, that drop they're talking about, could be a very, I don't know if 2014 was a very wet year or. what,
Yeah,
you know.
well, that's the chlorophyll, which is a different kind of a thing, but,
Right, but that's also being flushed out.
yeah.
As-
So, I mean, it's, normally you'd expect to see a big drop in salinity if that was really the case, and instead it kind of goes nowhere, or up, if anything. So,
Two little things. One is in line with the editing. Eric and Virginia both mentioned dredging for Little Pond, and they're right, of course. But in the report, he calls it widening the Little Pond inlet, and
He's got two recommendations. One's dredging and one is actually changing.
which we
the-
sort of rejected a long time ago for a variety of reasons. But it might confuse people. if
Widening's
they
in the,
think that
I think
actually-
that of the two South Coast estuaries, it was Bournes and Little Pond, where there could be a
Right.
significant impact.
But there was some reason why we didn't do Little Pond that I don't remember.
It was more that Bourne's Pond had a bigger bang for the buck, and, and we were already planning to sewer the Little Pond area, and so some people said, well, let's see what the effect of the sewering is before we go into the arena of widen Little Pond.
Which makes sense.
And there was also local opposition to widening Little
Yeah.
Pond.
Right, we were getting letters from people saying they would sue us if we did
Right,
such a thing.
Yes, so there were multiple reasons why,
Yeah.
although that was on the table, it was not pursued.
Right.
And if you need another reason, the permitting process for Bourne's Pond has cost the town $700,000.
I'm not suggesting that we widen Little Pond, I'm just saying that the report is suggesting it, and you
Well,
don't want
that's
to
true, the
upset
report-
people
well,
if
yes.
we're not going to widen it.
Right.
And the other thing that Eric Kay just brought out really nicely with some of his bar graphs is what we already knew from those nice colored pictures that we've seen before, that always have the red
Yep,
and
yep.
the head of the estuary.
Right.
That we should always, when we're picking the areas to sewer or to put IAs in, somebody should do at least a back of the envelope analysis of if you do, if you fix the head of the estuary, perhaps you've also fixed
Farther downstream.
a lot more, maybe the whole rest of the estuary.
I think that's a good point, but just want to temper a little bit with, we should remember there's less water up there also.
Well,
They tend to be shallower and narrower. And once you get closer to the mouth, they're
And less
wider
flushing.
and deeper.
That's.
right.
And it's flushed
That's why I
also.
said you have to do the analysis.
Yeah, exactly.
I
yeah.
think if we did the volumetric and looked at the concentration and figured out what the absolute mass of nitrogen was in each stretch of these estuaries, it may turn out that most of the nitrogen we have to deal with is way down near the inlet. Just because there's a larger volume of water, the lower concentration of nitrogen in that water means there's more actual nitrogen
Right, but
present
how
there.
much of it starts its life in the estuary? at the
Right,
head
well,
of the
we
estuary?
don't know, but I'm saying it's a little misleading because we always see these charts that are bright blood red at the
Right,
top.
good point, yes.
And look pretty good at the bottom.
Right.
But I'm just curious, I'm not a physical oceanographer, but I'm guessing that if you could calculate the masses of nitrogen that were present in each of those stretches, you'd get a somewhat different idea of what's happening there.
And I still want to say, we're looking at the dilution side, but also the build-out. We need to, even as part of the bar, part of the bar graph would be nice to say, okay, this much could be from
Right.
a certain percentage increase in nitrogen being discharged into the groundwater. So that's not here, but they know all about, all those early calculations were made.
Sure.
And so I still think build-out is another dimension to be added.
So the point of them presenting it to us at this point is for comment, and we've certainly gotten enough of that for Brian to go back and revisit some of this stuff. Eric, do you want to be the intermediary with him and pass along what
Absolutely.
the committee's been thinking, and
Yep. I will do that.
any further comments or observations? All right. The other piece on the agenda is, we distributed a printout of what we saw at the last meeting, the Suffolk County presentation. And the reason for that, I think, is we didn't have much time to talk about it. The presentation was kind of being presented, but there wasn't much time to kind of look at each element of it, and, because I find it absolutely fascinating how a place that has the same geology as we do and the same nitrogen challenge has been looking at it. And, with all candor, I think we're quite a bit ahead of them in a lot of respects. I mean, they have a much bigger problem and a much, they've got 250,000 people who still have cesspools.
But they seem to have lower oversight at the same time
Yes.
too, which might allow them
Yes.
to address it a lot quicker than us.
You're right.
What,
No, it'll let them address it a lot slower, because they don't have the money, and they know they don't have the money. and nobody's forcing them to address it.
Yeah, but when they come up with a solution, the state seems to say, okay, go for it.
Go for it, but they don't send them much money.
I have one question, and I meant to bring it up in the presentation before, when we were doing the live thing, but when it says that 250,000 systems predate requirements for a septic tank, does that mean they don't have a septic tank? And it's just a cesspool?
That's
Is that what you
that's-
took away?
That's what,
Then they should just say that, I think,
yeah.
because it was a little unclear, but that was the impression I got,
Yeah.
and that's kind of hard to believe.
Right. I was impressed at the numbers, at the number of different types of IAs that they were looking at. And that this program, each of those had been a company that contributed, donated its particular unit. So, you know, I remember we had Limonite and Hoot in West Falmouth. But there were
Because
names.
we're going for 10, and they're only going for 19.
Well,
That's the other
Well,
thing.
that, yes, and that needs to be commented on. They were only trying to achieve 19 milligrams per liter. And the fact that doesn't really make a significant difference doesn't seem to have been a discussion item in Long Island. Or at least it's definitely a major difference between what we're shooting for, which is under 10 milligrams per liter.
Right, but another key point may be the potential market size they're dealing with. If you're gonna do these systems and you're saying, you know, where can I market it? You may be looking at the large potential market, I'm guessing.
Well, he didn't make any attempt to present any kind of engineering analysis or
No, no,
economic
no, not at
analysis
all.
on why he chose 19, probably because it's the standard.
He
Yeah,
did-
no, what I mean is for the number of people that offered their equipment, donated it, I'm thinking, you know, foot in the door with a much bigger potential audience than we've got here.
You think there was more interest from the industry because the market is potentially larger?
That's my guess, that's
Sure.
purely a guess, and I'm just thinking, if you had a choice of sending your resources somewhere,
I see.
Yeah,
your
I think you're right.
multiplier,
Yeah,
Right.
your multiplier on Long Island is gonna be larger than your multiplier on Cape Cod. Again, that's pure speculation on my part. I-
We never asked them to provide free systems.
Yeah.
In our experiment, we said, show us your wares, let the people decide, and we'll give them money to put it in.
Yep.
And run.
No, I'm just, yeah, I think though that, again, this is Suffolk County. Now, we're comparing the town of Falmouth,
Yeah.
you know.
A
with-
neighborhood.
Yeah, like, what, 24,000 homes or something, and there's 125,000 or something on the Cape. So if it were a county thing, there might be some more gravity
Good point.
pulling this stuff in. So we're looking at, you know,
Oh, yeah.
dimensions.
Population is huge compared to here.
The other thing that
Yeah.
jumped out of the page here was they haven't done their MEPs yet. They identified 191
Yeah.
potential impaired water bodies, and that's as far as they've gone.
Yeah, that's what I meant, there's no analysis. There's no
Yeah.
analysis of how much do we have to remove, and what's the most economical way to
something
remove it.
Yep.
They don't
It was
even know
sort
the
of
first,
random.
the first question.
It was like the 208 report.
I found it interesting that when they looked at the whole picture, that a responsible management, municipal management entity is definitely part of their structure for if they do get to IAs, this would be needed. And I think that is one of the major accomplishments if we, this group and this town,
Right.
can get to that point, and that's what we're discussing for the Oyster Pond watershed. So to have the same idea turn up on a countywide level, I found reassuring.
Right, and I was gonna make the point, in a sense, it's simpler, just have one system countywide, much more efficient use of resources than each town on the Cape trying to do the same thing as other towns are doing.
Something else that they defined their three legs of their wastewater approach. One's sewers, fine. One's IA is fine. And the third one is neighborhood clusters, which we abandoned
Yes,
a long time ago.
yeah.
But we did it with an economic analysis.
Yes.
This is, while it was still a study group, Peter Boyer did the RFP. We had several companies come in, and we looked at Seacoast Shores specifically. So we took a real piece of real estate with a definite number of of houses and looked at if there was one cluster system for the peninsula, if we did 3 cluster systems, lower, middle, and upper, and hands down, it all came back, it was much more economical to go to a central sewer plant than it was to have local cluster systems. But if,
Right.
and we hired an engineering company to make that evaluation.
Which brings up another number that was thrown out without much comment. I think he said $60,000 to $100,000 per residence for sewer.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm no engineer either,
But-
financial analyst, but that number seems so far over the top too.
Yes.
We're close to 50,000
Yeah, I thought
for Bourne's
Cape,
Pond.
Cape
at this
Wide is
point.
50,000 if you do the numbers.
Okay, but
yeah.
60 to 100, when you're talking
Well,
50,
it's-
60.
That's different, it's Long Island.
Than the kind of
Something
bites
Yeah.
they get.
labor
Right.
costs.
The Hamptons.
There's certain,
Yeah.
there's certain, overcharge, overheads that they may have that we don't have so
Right.
much from. But another thing you did mention, though, that I think was good, is it's something they're working on, that we have discussed as well, is the equity issue. And that if, let's say, that, like even with Oyster Pond, if you have to put in so many of these systems or something, and some houses don't, some do, we don't need to do everything, so then how does that, who pays, and then how is it shared as a mutual benefit? This is, even with sewering, I mean, if we don't go all the way down the peninsulas, because it's a long way to go with the pipe, it may be that the lower homes.
Well, you also have to be careful with the analysis of clusters. I think what Virginia said about Seacoast Shores is correct, but we also looked at it for Oyster Pond, because Hui has its own facility there,
That's true.
and had they been willing, I mean, they had good and legitimate reasons for not letting us send our sewage over to them. But if that had worked out, it might have been economical. The other possibility was to put something on the Peterson farm. Objections to that, but that's just because of the particular specifics of that piece of land and the fact that in Seacoast Shores, there is no extra land.
There is no, right.
So maybe
Non-existent.
he has a number of areas where he does have land.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Well, the neighborhood cluster thing really died around here once we figured out that that meant you would have to site a sewer plant in every
Exactly.
neighborhood.
That's what I'm saying,
And,
yeah.
NIMBY,
that
raising
wasn't
its
gonna, that
ugly
wasn't
head.
gonna happen.
Now gonna happen.
So that fell off the table pretty fast. They had a funny little thing on their grant program where if you made up to over $500,000, you couldn't get the money, but if you made $250,000 a year, you could.
Yep. I was a little surprised at those numbers also.
Well, that's correlated with the sewer costs, that's what I meant when I said it's going out.
But to actually tell people they have to provide you with their annual income, we've never thought about going there in order to get municipal assistance.
That wouldn't happen at Mar-a-Lago.
Okay, let's not go there. Getting back to the company buy-in on the IA systems, I'm just curious if there's some discussions we could have around that. If we feel like with the grant programs that we have going now, do we have enough systems in the pipeline that will get some good answers enough to, recommend them or approve them? Or
Yeah.
do we want to think about how we might get more in the ground with some kind of a company incentive program? And if so, what, I guess, what could we actually offer, a company if we were to do have such a program?
I think those are good questions. I sure don't have answers to them. Some of these companies I never heard of, but others I have heard of. And again, we do have a loss of knowledge here because SIA was the one that had originally looked at a broader range of companies, and then that, for a variety of reasons, got weeded down to about 5 or 6. And, I'm not sure what the thinking was. I do think when we finally, start saying, okay, here's Oyster Pond watershed, and we're gonna, if the decision is made, we're gonna do IAs, we need to think very carefully about the procurement process, so that, first of all, that it's not challengeable, and second, that it casts a wide enough net that we get the companies that could perform it. but it needs to be at 10 milligrams per liter, and that's one of the major differences. They're only looking at 19. So maybe these other companies fall out if you say it's 10.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
what
they
I
all-
wanted
they
to
all-
say,
Is
is
that what
that
you're gonna
a
say?
large part
They
of
all
the
fall
amount.
out.
Those companies would all fall out, and that was
Yeah.
one of the big things. It's hard to find companies that are targeting that and able to deliver.
But I have heard George and John Waterbury, George Hoyfelder and John Waterbury, both say that when it becomes obvious that the town is serious, that the companies will come out of the woodwork
And do 10,
and do 10.
Yeah.
yeah,
And that they will be able to do that.
yeah.
I think the main thing, and what we have to offer them, is a chance to get up to pilot or provisional or general.
That's
Right.
right.
Exactly.
And what we have to make sure of, though, is that we take at least 2 companies, and preferably 3, along to that level. Otherwise, if you do only one, they have you
Yes.
for the whole rest of the town.
Right.
The other companies can't touch them.
And I honestly believe that there's enough economic interest from other companies that we would not get away with that, of doing just one. I think there have to be 2 or 3. I would feel much better with 3.
Well, the one thing they and we both do along the same lines is this management protocol.
Right.
We're all at least heading in the same direction on that.
Right. Okay.
The numbers that they propose to put in the ground compared to the scope of their problem is just unbelievable. I mean, they're talking in the dozens,
I know.
and they've got 350,000.
Yeah,
Problems.
that's what I meant.
It's a start.
Well, we don't have to take a vote, but
Okay.
I think it's worth looking at what somebody else is trying to do and how they're
Yes.
trying to do it. And we're not so far behind as we might thought. Okay, report of members and staff. You went to a conference all
Yeah.
day, what do you think?
So there was a meeting held at MBL on Tuesday, led by the EPA, but motivated by an effort of the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition to deal with the nitrogen problem in the 3 bays
Mm-hmm.
estuaries. And so, there was a presentation on the problems that they're facing in that series of in that watershed, and followed by some breakout groups to talk about potential solutions. And the solutions, the alternative solutions. The alternative solutions that were discussed were shellfish, aquaculture, the usual.
The usual.
Yeah, IAs, PRBs, and natural constructed wetlands.
Mm.
And I wasn't able to stay through the entire day, but I participated in a PRB breakout session in
Good.
the morning,
Mhm.
and that was very productive. There were I feel like half the room was filled with EPA staff, which was a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they heard the message, loud and clear from both myself and Ken Foreman, and one of the town planners for Barnstable, Rob, do you remember his name? Rob Steen. Who, and EPA heard the message loud and clear that they need to put some money into R&D on these things. We need more PRBs
Right.
in the ground.
In the
So-
ground,
In the ground.
right.
Yeah.
And we need the grant funding to help us do it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and that it's not, and that was, Rob was, from Barnstable, was fantastic in helping us make the case that the towns are not gonna be putting a lot of money behind this, because they're not in the business of R&D. They
Right.
need if they're gonna put money into something, it needs to be
Mhm.
somewhat proven.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is a state or a federal funding
Okay,
example.
so
Yeah.
hopefully out of that, there would be another grant round with, and it needs to be a hefty amount of money. We're
Yeah, we
300,
made that clear
400,000.
that, a lot of the grant proposals, because they're capped at a certain amount, they're compromised, and, you're not able to do the density of sampling or all the analyses that you would like to do to prove that there are no unintended consequences, or what the actual costs are of
Mhm.
of doing this. And so, in our work breakout group, we came up with the idea of, having at least one or maybe two that are heavily, heavily instrumented and might test out different approaches to PRBs in one location. So,
Okay.
for example, the EVO injection that we've talked about,
Yes.
Ken Foreman had an idea for, essentially driving sonotubes into the ground with wood chips. So rather than trenching, which would be very expensive if you have to go down 10, 20, 30 meters,
Right.
having sonotubes filled with wood chips, which would be low permeability and might draw enough groundwater in that could be as effective and potentially longer-term carbon source than
Than the
EVO,
EVO.
which might need to be recharged every 5 or 10 years.
Right.
So it'd be, it's when you get scientists into a room to talk about what would you love to have if money wasn't an issue. Of course, we dreamed up the,
Well,
I
came up
think
with lots
that
of
idea's
great
been around.
ideas.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
The vertical boring and putting wood chips in.
Yeah,
There may have been some work on that.
that's something that Ken was advocating for as an alternative to the EVO
as an idea,
and
but
trenching.
we get back to, it's not been done. It's all conceptual.
But then here's another question for all of you. If you were the benevolent dictator of the EPA, of the money they were gonna spend that could benefit Cape Cod, would you, and they only had a finite amount of money, would you have them putting it into PRB research or IA research?
I would
Well-
have it into IAs, frankly.
I would be inclined to do both.
I
Well,
would
Play
say,
both ends against the middle, because the
Yeah.
potential impact of a 40 or 50-foot deep PRB, and to do that, I think it really has to be done with a liquid, and it can be done with lateral drilling. And once you have this stuff in place in the ground, I don't think it would be a big hassle on a 5 or 7 or 10-year cycle to put more carbon in there. The idea of one of those, or several of those staggered mostly east-west across Falmouth, to me, looks really attractive. And instead of having to go door to door, because that's what it's gonna be, saying to people, you have to do this, and it's gonna cost you this much. I'm being philosophical here, but that's my bias,
Yeah.
is if you could get this curtain of carbon, I'm not gonna try to trademark that. If you could put this subterranean curtain of carbon in, and the vast majority of the groundwater is gonna have to make its way through that, but again,
And the problem is the site.
Yes,
And
the highways.
for the curtain of carbon.
the highways,
That,
we've got a couple, I've already got them picked out.
okay.
And the fact that each one has to be engineered individually.
right.
It's
And
as
mon-
if, it's
and
as if
monitored.
Ford Motor had to R&D every single car. Not each
No.
model, but each car.
Yeah, but we're only talking about 4 or 5 of these in the entire town. They're not being engineered individually, because you can now drill laterally over a mile underground with directional drilling, and you have only a couple of wellheads, a couple of small surface presents. It's no different than the hydrofracking technology that's out there now, except on a much smaller scale, because
Those are certainly legitimate advantages, but it is possible to do a calculation,
Mhm.
a business calculation of which one has the better return on investment.
Right.
When you can put down all the advantages and disadvantages, the best numbers you can get for each one, and look at it.
Oh, I agree. I'm just saying
Can't do it in my
philosophically,
head.
I'm just spinning
And-
my
and
little.
we don't have those numbers for PRBs.
No, we don't.
No.
Mainly because you don't know the longevity of the EVO.
Yes.
But you can get ranges you can say, if it turns out really well, they really are head and shoulders above IAs, or it could turn out that even if it turns out very well, they're head and shoulders below IAs.
Right.
But the issue won't ever come up until they actually put something in the ground.
Right.
Yep,
They-
that's the problem.
They have to gamble some money.
I can continue to spin my castles in the clouds, but
But there is is it in Orleans? Where's the one that's
That flopped,
Orleans,
that
yeah.
flopped. right.
Well,
did?
or-
Oh,
Do you know why?
Yes.
wow.
yeah, but it's
They put it in
not, it's not
parallel to the
defunct.
flow.
Okay.
Oh,
So that is being funded by Orleans itself. It's not a grant. They did some miscalculations on the groundwater flow. There are various reasons why that happened. And so that's now being corrected. And so that they are still continuing with that project. Corleans has not dropped it. But clearly, there has been no results that we can
No.
interpret
No.
because they had this original miscalculation.
Now, this latest SNEP round of grants did give the vineyard $250,000 to do a PRB, a reasonably short one.
Yes.
Wasn't that discussed at all? The one on Martha's Vineyard?
No,
Okay.
I don't actually even know who's.
Could you find out what that's,
Adam Tra-
who and what?
Cape Cod,
I could
the Martha's
try.
Vineyard Commission is the applicant.
Yeah, and I don't know,
They're
I
gonna
can't
do-
imagine that they're actually doing they're the applicant, but I
Right.
can't imagine they conceive
Right,
the
I don't know
project.
who they're working with, I don't know.
Um,
This conference was sort of interesting in that there were 25 EPA bureaucrats in attendance.
Wow.
From all, and it wasn't just Boston. Some came from Florida. There was some from headquarters,
Right, they came-
Washington.
Region 1, Region 2, Region 4, and
Yeah.
20 of them from the Office of Research and Development.
Right.
Wow.
So, yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of homeowners in the three-base watershed with influence. So I'm just saying, put two and two together there, and you might guess why this
Was-
workshop came to be.
Yes,
I don't know that that's a
Okay.
fact, but I'm just drawing a
Yeah.
line between
Yeah.
the two.
Well, it's great that Three Bays
And who
could
funded
do
the
it.
workshop?
I think,
I think that they did get a grant, and this
Yeah.
is a pre-grant,
Right,
yeah,
sure.
workshop, so I think it was E EPA.
Probably, to ship them all down and send them all back. But I think frankly, the EPA people learn more than we did. Certainly, they got the message, which is put your money into the ground and into the water with real projects and not paper projects.
got a map here.
We'll see what they do. Any other reports of members and staff?
Yeah, I can say that we've had 2 aquaculture committee meetings so far, and as you might expect from the first couple meetings, it's not super organized, but we're moving forward. But one of the things I'd like input from this committee on is we're trying to establish criteria for aquaculture operators, what we would state as what the town is looking for, and in particular, I'd like input from this committee, maybe at the next meeting or whatever, but it's something to be thinking about, is, you know, what is our interest in the capabilities of an operator that we might put forth? And the other thing is,
Can you suggest an example,
Yeah.
other than the obvious that you'd want for anyone doing aquaculture, even if it had nothing to do with water quality?
well, there's the nuts and bolts stuff, because I've already pulled down some requirements from several towns in the state and even out of state. Massachusetts is weird because, well, you already know that, but Massachusetts, the town sets the shellfish regulations. Every other state, the state sets the shellfish regulations statewide. So there's a crazy quilt of regulations, but I got the requirements from Fairhaven, Bourne, and Nantucket, I believe. It's ones I have right now. And but there's a nuts and bolts things, like the operator has to be 18. Most places insist, in Massachusetts, because we have this townwide thing, that you have to be a resident of that town, or domiciled, is a term that Nantucket uses, and they have to be domiciled for the length of the period they're operating the grant. Then beyond that, Delaware requires a performance bond of $2,000 per acre, so that if you go bankrupt, somebody's going to go clean up your stuff for you, whatever gear you've got left there. And they also require a $1 million, $2 million liability
Really?
coverage per operator, and Bourne, interestingly enough, has those kind of
That's-
requirements.
But
That
all
might-
those things you'd want,
Yeah.
even if it
Yeah,
had
those are
nothing to do
stumbling
with water.
blocks,
I'm
so-
trying to
Business
think
owners.
what,
So
Yeah.
do we want someone with a proven track record? Do we want someone that perhaps has a degree in aquaculture?
No.
Do we want someone that demonstrates financial capabilities? Because we're taking a bet. If we're gonna offer a chunk of town land to someone for 2 years, we'd like for them to succeed.
Is it only 2
Or
years?
well, we're talking 3 years. All of that is still up in the air. But anyway, just if you have any other thoughts about that.
You might want a marketing plan, just,
Well, that's the other thing. I said business plan, and everybody else says, oh, no, we can't require that. But, so,
What about having them, having an auction? The highest, the
Well-
person willing to pay the most had better be serious.
there seems to be a consensus also that the town is likely to require a kickback.
Yeah, and you have an auction of that. The highest
that
bidder
of,
wins.
of a certain amount of the production is gonna come back to the town. And I don't know how that's gonna work out, but that's in play too. But anyway, I just throwing that out, and just people to think about it, and we're in the early stages of that. The other thing, and I sent Brian Howes a note about this, and I haven't heard back from him. They're talking about another large contaminated shellfish relay from Falmouth Inner Harbor to somewhere else.
Okay.
And I asked Brian if he had any ideas what the implications might be for the Inner Harbor, for Falmouth Inner Harbor, if they did remove thousands and thousands of mature cohogs out of there. So, but again, I haven't heard back, but it just suddenly occurred to me while they're talking about this, and so I don't know.
well, don't they bring in new seed to replace them and they grow them there?
Well, that or new seed settles because there's enough left over to spawn. I don't know the dynamics of that either, but I know the places they've cleaned out in the past are repopulated pretty quickly with smaller shellfish, which
Yeah.
may tie up more nitrogen more quickly than these big old mature daddy cohogs are doing that are
Well,
years and
aren't
years
the
old.
two things, is you want them to do it responsibly and legally, of course, and safely.
Right. Oh, yeah, there's-
They want that anyway.
Right,
And the main thing we want is high productivity.
right.
You want them to have skin in the game, that if they don't have productivity, they
Right.
can't sit on it and-
Exactly,
and keep
that-
someone else from coming in.
The towns do have performance standards, too. I can't remember which town, but a typical number is 10,000 shellfish per acre. And it doesn't specify whether that's seed or marketable adults, but that's over a 3-year average. 3-year running mean, sort of. That would be, if they failed, they'd be subject, and again, I'm thinking it's Nantucket. Nantucket had the most complete set. They'd be subject to a hearing by the Board of Selectmen to continue whether to decide whether to renew the license or not if they weren't meeting the performance standards. But again, it's, in Massachusetts, again, is unique. It's a crazy quilt of town-by-town regulations, but we've started looking at that.
Ron, you got any thoughts?
No, nothing, no, you got your expert.
I don't know about
So I
that,
think that's
but I was
good.
hoping for a little bit of input from you.
I don't know, I haven't really been following it, so I don't know.
Yeah, and
Any
that's those two things, were the
Okay.
things.
Any other reported members and staff? Okay, you have a town meeting article that people should know about.
Well, I've mentioned it to the committee before. This is the Coastal Pond Overlay District map that was originally missing 4 watersheds. And it's, it's making its way through the town machinery. So it's now on the warrant. The planning board has approved it. And so at town meeting, it's Article 6. And I will make a brief presentation, the old map and then the new map, which looks like that. And this is the database that is consistent with what GHD is using and what the Cape Cod Commission is using, and it is based on USGS. It's the USGS study from 2005.
And I'd like to point out, there's a pretty powerful tool in there because you can ramp it right up. When you got it in your computer, you can call up that and ramp it right up to the level of individual residents.
Exactly.
And see exactly
Which properties are in.
which property and where the line is running, and I see some interesting fights down the line.
Well,
If we have to make watershed by watershed decisions.
Sure.
But if you want to sit, we got a few minutes to blow someday, just sit down and start
Yeah.
cruising through there
Right.
at high resolution.
right.
All right, any other reports of members and staff? How about voting the minutes of the prior meeting? They were all sent around, everybody got to look at them.
Oh.
That's October 18th. Tom, have you got?
Yes, I do have one minor thing, and it's on my report. Eric, you said 25-year flood condition. What it is 25-year rainfall condition, and that's set up with, their scaling is maximum rainfall in a couple of minutes versus maximum rainfall in 24 or 48 hours. So anyway, that's the only thing I would change, was
What page was that?
that was at the end of item 4, the very last sentence. Projects designed to handle up to a 25-year flood condition, and I would strike flood and substitute rainfall, because that's what it's.
Motion to approve with Tom's suggested change.
And I apologize for having so little to add to the discussion.
Moved and seconded. Further discussion? All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it.
Motion to adjourn?
I'll second that.
Second,
So our next
okay.
meeting will
There's a
be
rush to do that.
Moved and seconded. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Bang. Next meeting.